Be the right club. Be the right club today.
Johnny, that's better than most.
How about in?
That is better than most. Better than most.
Expect anything different?
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the No Laying Up podcast. Welcoming in Columbus Business School professor and the author of Every Shot Counts, Mr. Mark Brody. Mark, I was going through our direct messages. I had first contacted you to come on the podcast about 4 years ago and somehow criminally never followed up on that. But welcome, and we're finally making this happen.
Oh, well, thanks for having me, Chris. It's a pleasure after all these years.
No, looking forward to one. I think I've learned a lot. And for the record, I want to, before I say it, this is not a book promotion. You did not ask to come on to promote your book, but I read your book, Every Shot Counts, several years ago, and it changed the way that I thought about golf and followed your work very closely after that. So I've always looked forward to talking stats with you. And I think listeners to this will understand maybe, some I would say don't know at all what strokes gained is, but I think some understand it roughly. And even talking to some of the other No Laying Up guys before we started recording, they're like, yeah, I want to learn about this. I need to know about this. So I think people are going to learn quite a bit. But I'm sure you've told the story many times. But first, I want to get kind of an understanding of what your background was and how you ended up kind of revolutionizing the way golf is analyzed from a statistical standpoint.
Well, I got into this, many years ago now. Some people, you mentioned the book, think that, oh, I decided to write a book and a year later a book is published, and that's not at all what happened. I started, playing golf when I was a teenager, and so it's been sort of a personal passion of mine. And then I, became an academic, and I teach and do research at Columbia Business School in New York, and so my professional passion is analytics. And then I said, well, I can put these two together because there's so many unanswered questions in the game of golf. And so I got to combine my personal and professional passions in doing golf analytics. And the questions I originally sought to answer were things like, what's the difference between a golfer whose average score is 90 and a golfer whose average score is 80? Where do those 10 strokes come from? Or you could say the same about a scratch golfer and a touring professional. Where do those, strokes come from? And it's not at all obvious that where they come from, in part because traditional stats just don't have a hope of answering questions like that. If you count, fairways hit or greens hit, greens in regulation or putts, there's just no way you can decode what's really going on in the game of golf. So that was the original intent, and I started this way back in 2000 and 2001.
Did you, I kind of looked to, and I was kind of a big proponent. I used to be a much bigger baseball fan than I currently am, but was a big fan of sabermetrics in baseball and kind of bucking the trends of using batting average, home runs, RBIs. And as always, I think with golf, things just always tend to lag behind other sports. Was there any kind of motivation from seeing statistical trends or kind of more robust statistical analysis in other sports that led you to wonder, like, are golf statistics that we currently use the best ones?
No, that really wasn't the motivation at all. But I think it's very different because baseball being a team sport and having a much longer history of baseball stats, and golf being an individual sport and sort of being in the dark ages in terms of the stats. But there are a lot of parallels, and I'm fortunate enough to be an academic, and I now teach elective course on sports analytics. And I spend most of the time on the major sports, baseball, basketball, football. And there's a lot of parallels between the analytics you can do in those sports and what goes on in golf. And it was sort of surprising to me that strokes gained basically has parallels or analogs in all the other sports.
Was there when you set out to kind of start the analysis, were you kind of aware that I guess, did you already kind of know what you were going to discover, or were you thinking like, all right, I realized that, putting is overrated, blah, 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 I just need to prove it? Or was it kind of a revelation once you started gathering all this data, what you ended up discovering?
Oh, it was definitely a revelation. I didn't start with a question like how important is putting. I started with a question, where are these 10 strokes between a 90 golfer and an 80 golfer? Or, put another way, if I gave you a magic club where you could hit, your drives 20 yards further, what would happen to your score? So those are the kinds of questions I was trying to answer. And to answer those questions, you needed, number one, data. And there just wasn't any data out there. This is again around 2000, 2001 to answer these questions. It was before the ShotLink system on the PGA Tour. It was before GPS had, all these commercial applications. So it's before, Game Golf and Arccos and a bunch of others. And so the first step was really, how do I get data? In this case, for amateur golfers. And like many people before me said, well, I'll start collecting data and put it into an Excel spreadsheet, and quickly, as in in an hour or so, realize that that's not really the way to go. And so spent a couple of years building a desktop program called Golf Metrics to be able to have amateurs collect data, which ended up looking almost identical to the ShotLink data that the PGA Tour started to collect in 2003. So the first were these questions, and then was the data. It was only after starting to analyze the data that I said, well, now that I've got all this data, how exactly do we answer the questions? And it was only after that some of the insights about the importance of putting and approach shots and other things came out. So that was a surprise.
What would you say was the most noteworthy thing you learned once you had accumulated all the data?
That the findings, the insights, the results were very consistent across a wide range of golfer groups. So if you take a look at the difference between a high handicapper and a middle handicapper, a low handicapper, between average tour pros and the best tour pros, the same sorts of results hold, namely that about 65% of the scoring differences occur from shots outside 100 yards and about 35% from shots within 100 yards of the hole. And so, 10 strokes, if you want to go from a typical 90 golfer to a typical 80 golfer, about 6.5 of those 10 shots come from being better off the tee and outside 100 yards, and about 3.5 of those strokes come from, being better inside 100 yards, including putting.
So what's something that you've heard on television over the years, or especially after doing all your research, you hear now and just cringe as just something that's just flat out not true?
So
there's a lot, I'm sure.
Yeah, there's a lot. This is maybe not related to my research, but you hear that touring pros swing at 80%. I don't think so. You see how far they hit it? They're not swinging at 80%. I think what you see is great rhythm and balance, and so it looks like it's effortless, but they're swinging really hard and really fast. There's a lot of others that you just sort of shake your head at. So they'll say a player is 19 out of 20 on putts inside of 10 feet at the tournament this week. And that could be factually correct. So it's not like shaking my head like they're saying something that's wrong, but the implication is that this player is now standing over a 9-foot putt. And the implication is that they have a 95% chance of sinking it, which is way far from the truth, because most of those putts inside of 10 feet are actually inside of 3 feet. So it's sort of just a meaningless waste of airtime to talk about, how many putts have they sunk inside of 10 feet. It would actually be better to talk about how many putts did they sink between 5 and 10 feet than, inside of 10 feet.
No, to your first point, I remember the first time I ever saw Ernie Els swing a club in person. I was a kid. I couldn't believe it. I mean, you could hear the club in the transition phase. You could hear the wind that came off the club face for how hard he swung it. And he makes it look so effortless. So I'm glad to hear you say that. And secondly, yeah, the point on your putting, every time I see that stat, it does kind of jar you, and I get why they pop it up there. You know, especially I think somebody had one the other week that they were 54 of 54 inside of 10 feet. But another one that gets me is I never know what a good number is, but when somebody tells you how many feet of putts you've made over the course of the day, does that stat mean anything to you?
No, other than, larger is better.
Yeah. But you could have made a 150-foot putt. It skews everything. But
exactly.
Yeah, that one always confuses me. But it also kind of, I guess I'll ask it in the form of a question in that if you could sum up when Tiger Woods was dominating the PGA Tour, if you could summarize how he went about doing that or the leading factor that went into his domination of the PGA Tour, what would you say that was?
That's an easy one. He dominated with his approach shots, and that's a surprise to most people, but if you think about the traditional golf stats, that's the hardest part of the game to measure. There is no one of the traditional golf stats that, directly measures approach shots, approach play. The closest might be greens in regulation, and there's many flaws with greens in regulation, but, that includes drives and approach shots, and there's other flaws with that we could talk about. But one of the misconceptions about Tiger Woods is that Tiger Woods was a great putter. And so people say, yeah, he was a great putter. That must be the reason, he won so many majors and so many tournaments. And that's true. He was a great putter, but he gained more than twice as many strokes from his approach shots as from his putts. So there's not an inconsistency there that putting was really not the key to his performance. It was approach shots, but he was really good at the short game. He was actually, for most of his career, a really good driver, and that's why he's sort of Tiger Woods, as opposed to Ernie Els or Phil Mickelson or some other great players. That Tiger Woods was great at everything, but the one part of his game that really stood out was his approach shots. And one way to phrase that I often talk about in seminars or talks is that if Tiger Woods was an average driver, had an average short game, and was an average putter, and you just let him have his superior approach shots, he would be in the top 10 in the world.
Yeah. And I think you hear it almost more these days, maybe not as much in the last year, but in the last 5 years, people say, oh, Tiger, he just can't putt like he used to. That's what's really holding him back currently, when I think in reality he doesn't have nearly the same advantage over the other players from tee to green. Is that something you would agree with?
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. And even in his most recent comeback where he's been, playing great and, doing very well at Bay Hill and almost winning at Valspar and others. He's been putting really well, and one of the things that's been holding him back is his approach shots. And not that they're not good. His approach shots, I had him ranked something like 25th in the 2018 season, but he's not like number one like he used to be. If you went back from 2003 to 2013, he was in the top 5 in strokes gained from approach shots every single year, with most of those years ranked number 1. And, 1 year he's ranked 5th, and a couple years he was ranked 4th, and almost all the other years he was ranked 1. And he was just phenomenal with his approaches. To give you an example, the leaders in approach shots for a typical year might be at, 1.3 strokes gained per round. And there is a number of years where Tiger was at 2 strokes per round. And it's like, wow, I mean, he's already 8 strokes ahead in the tournament, before
that's amazing.
Before everybody else tees it up. So why did he win so much? Well, to win, you need to get to about 3.5 or 3.7 strokes gained per round, and he was getting 2 just from his approach shots. And you throw in that he was a good putter or a great putter, and then you add the other stuff, and he was winning at 30-40% win rate in certain seasons.
I can only imagine the depth of at which your amazing Tiger stats go, but that's fantastic. All right, Tron, a quick break. We announced this past week that we're going to be playing in the BMW Charity Pro-Am in Greenville, South Carolina in May against each other. Why don't you fill us in a little bit on the details?
Yeah, we've got all the details on the website, but just for your edification, Callaway giving away a ton of prizes, Rogue drivers, Rogue 3-woods, putters, wedges, balls,
irons, everything. Yeah. So we'll announce the official prizes eventually. What are you going to be playing with? We've been meaning to do a what's in the bag, and we haven't done it yet. What are you going to be playing with next month?
The big addition to the bag lately has been this new EXO putter.
It's got me a little nervous.
I think you're scared.
You're rolling it a little bit better last night. We're not going to say our scores from last night, but what else you got?
I'll be honest, I shot 84.
Okay,
I already posted it.
I shot 86.
No, I mean, the Rogue's been awesome. I'm still playing the Apex Pros. I think I'm going to put the X-Forged in the bag, though.
That's the current dilemma I'm under. I love the Apex Pros, but I've got the X-Forged, and it's just too tempting. They're sitting over there. But we're gonna do more what's in the bag stuff in the future, but want to update you guys on the prizes and stuff. And big shout out to Callaway for helping chip in with the charity giveaway. So check that out. The details on our website. Now let's get back to Mark Brody. So I want to get into kind of strokes gained. It's something obviously you've talked a ton about, and we'll get into some of the nitty-gritty details. But first, I want to know, so stats like driving accuracy and greens in regulation, I feel like 5 years ago or so, even up to then, they were still being used, but they're kind of becoming extinct, which I'd like to see. But can you explain to us why stats like driving accuracy and greens in regulation are not very useful?
Sure, there are so many flaws, and I'll try and give you a brief answer. But number one flaw is units. That it's very hard to measure driving distance, which is in yards, versus putting, which is in strokes, versus hitting fairways, which is just you hit a fairway or you don't. They're not in the right units, and that makes these kind of things incomparable. How do you compare a player who drives it 10 yards further with another player who hits 50% of his fairways versus 60%? It's very hard to compare when you have different units. So another thing that's wrong is that greens in regulation and driving accuracy are these counting stats. You either hit a green in regulation or you don't. You either hit a fairway on your tee shot or you don't. They don't distinguish between big misses and little misses. So if you miss the fairway into the fringe of the fairway, the first cut, then that's not a big penalty. You're in the rough, that's a bigger penalty. You're in the woods, that should be a bigger penalty. You put it in the water, that should be a bigger penalty. You put it out of bounds, that should be an even bigger penalty. And strokes gained takes all of that into account, whereas driving accuracy is just you hit the fairway or you didn't. It's the same thing with greens in regulation. You can hit a green and it counts, but you don't get extra credit hitting it 5 feet from the pin versus 20 feet from the pin. And if you miss a green, well, every missed green counts as 0. They count the same. But if you miss on the fringe versus missing in the sand versus missing in the water, those are really different misses that all count as a missed green in regulation. So another flaw of traditional stats is they're just 0-1 kind of things, and they don't take into account these fractional differences in shots, which are really important. And the third thing is there's no adjustment for what is the field doing versus playing at one course versus another. So to give you one example, the average driving distance at, say, TPC Scottsdale might be 300 yards, and the average distance a week or so ago at Harbortown was 275 yards. So if you don't measure things relative to the field, a player that plays at Harbortown is going to look like he's 25 yards shorter than somebody else that plays at TPC Scottsdale, even though the player hasn't changed their driving distance at all. Just, the driving distance stat shouldn't be fooled by which course you played. So that's just a few of the flaws. Does that give you enough?
That sums it up. Yeah, that sums it up pretty perfectly. Just saying that, I wonder how badly DJ's driving distance took a hit by playing the Heritage this last week. But
well, his driving distance took a hit, but if you measure it relative to the field, it was quite interesting.
Right.
At Kapalua, he was 25 yards longer than average, and at Harbortown, he was 20 yards longer than average.
Wow.
So if you measure things relative to the field, you get a much better picture. And I was really curious. You got Dustin Johnson playing at Harbortown. What is going to happen? And yeah, he was a lot shorter than his usual, but he still, hit it further and, hit it out there 20 yards further than the field average at Harbortown.
Yeah, we didn't even discuss the flaw in the driving distance stat, but I think that one's so flawed we don't even need to discuss. But I can't imagine how many times you have tried to explain this over the years, and it does make sense to me. But in your best way to somebody that doesn't know what strokes gained is, how would you explain it to them?
So if you have a tough par 4 where the stroke average is 4.2, then a par in the hole is a good score. You're beating the field, but you're beating the field by 0.2 of a stroke. So if you compare the field average 4.2 with the player's score, in this case of 4, then the player is gaining 0.2 of a stroke. That's basically what strokes gain does, is it measures performance relative to the field. And then the question is, well, how do you break that down further into each stroke? And it's the same idea, which is you want to measure the quality of a shot relative to an average tour player's shot from that particular spot or from that condition. So let's take putting to start with. If a tour player has a 30-foot putt, what would the field do? What would be an average performance on a 30-foot putt? And the answer would be they'd get down in about 2 strokes. The PGA Tour average from 30 feet is 2. So if you sink a 30-footer, you're doing 1 better than the field average. And if you take 2 putts, you're even. And if you take 3 putts, you lose a stroke. So that's sort of the simplest way to measure putting, is not just by counting putts, but by measuring it relative to what the average tour pro would do. And so that sounds like it's the same as sort of counting putts, but where it gets interesting is when you take a look at other distances. So the other easy one to talk about is putting from 8 feet. So from 8 feet, tour pros have a 50% 1-putt rate and a 50% 2-putt rate. So they average 1.5 putts from 8 feet. So if a tour pro sinks an 8-footer, they take 1 versus the average of 1.5, they'll gain a half a stroke on the field. And if they take 2 putts from 8 feet, they'll lose a half a stroke on the field. So every shot can be measured relative to what an average PGA Tour player would do from that situation. And all strokes gain does is it adds up those fractional gains and losses over every shot to come up with how many they gain or lose on the hole, and then how much they gain or lose on the round. And now you've got a nice breakdown. If a player beat the field by 2.7 strokes in a round, then where did they gain or lose? And you can follow it all the way down to each individual shot. But at an intuitive level, if you see a great shot on TV or at a tournament, it's going to have positive strokes gained. And if you see a poor shot, it's going to have negative strokes gained. And all strokes gained does, it sort of quantifies that in terms of fractional gains and losses relative to an average tour player.
I think we can approach it 2 ways. We can start at the hole and work backwards and work from the tee to the hole. But I think in reading your book, the one of the biggest things I took away from was that I was placing way too much blame on my putting for my poor scoring, in that the finality of having an 8-foot putt for a par, and when I miss it, I say, I just cost myself a stroke by missing that putt, without factoring in the fact that only a tour pro makes this putt 50% of the time, and so there's going to be some variance. If I keep leaving myself 8-foot par putts, maybe I'm doing something along the way that is not setting myself up. So in my mind, I had set out that I was just a terrible putter, and I kind of opened my eyes like, no, I'm not a terrible putter. Like, I hit 8 greens today, and I left myself a bunch of 8 and 10 footers. And so I hear people say like, oh, you should spend the most money on a putter. It's the club you're going to use the most throughout the round. Explain to me why that's a bad way of thinking.
So one of the European tour pros that I've been friends with for a long time is Edoardo Molinari, and you might also know his brother Francesco Molinari, who's now playing on the PGA Tour. But Edoardo said this: if I had a contest with an amateur, and we could choose between having a 9-hole putting contest, or we could hit 9 tee shots on a 200-yard par 3. Who do you think would win? And the answer is Eduardo Molinari is going to kill most any amateur hitting 200-yard approach shots to a hole. He's going to hit the green more often. He's going to get closer to the hole. A 9-hole putting contest, an amateur would have a chance, even against a tour pro. It may only be a 25 or 30% chance, but an amateur would have a chance of winning a 9-hole putting contest with a tour pro. An amateur would have no chance at winning sort of a 9-hole approach shot contest with a tour pro from 200 yards. The differences are just, dramatic from that range. The differences in skill levels.
It's a good way to think of it, and it also just goes towards the handicap system, right? The longer the hole, typically the lower the handicap number. Essentially saying this is going to be easier for a low handicapper and harder for a high handicapper. Digging in a little bit more on putting. So let's say we have this 8-foot putt that is essentially a 1.5 average, 50-50 that a tour pro will make it. Does your data give any information on whether that is pretty consistent for a downhill or uphill putt? And also like the data that we see from the PGA Tour, if we, is it factoring in the slope of a putt, the break of a putt into the likelihood that somebody will make it, which will ultimately affect their strokes gained putting?
So this is a sort of an esoteric distinction, but I think of strokes gained as performance relative to a benchmark. And so that's the theoretical concept, and then you can implement that in a number of different ways. And in the implementation we worked with the PGA Tour, all 8-foot putts are equal, and the average that goes into that is 1.5, as we talked about. But there's no reason that you can't be more accurate in creating the benchmark than that. And I've done this analysis before, and it is true that on the steepest fast greens, that there's a big difference between an 8-foot downhill putt and an 8-foot uphill putt. And so there may be a 20% difference in make rates. So for example, an uphill 8-footer, pros make 55% of those, and a downhill just 35%. So there's a 20% difference in those make rates between uphill and downhill putts. But those are only on the steepest greens, which are less than 5% of greens are that steep. On more typical slopes that you see where holes are cut on the PGA Tour, the difference in uphill and downhill make rates on 8-foot putts is about 7%. So they'll make 54% of uphill putts and maybe 47% of downhill putts. And so the amount that you're missing if you sort of ignore the uphill downhill difference is just a fraction of a stroke. It's 0.03 or something. It's 3.5 or whatever. It's really a minor difference. So I think of counting putts as being sort of very crude and doesn't give you a good ranking or a good measure of putting performance. Strokes gained putting, when you just look at the distance of the putt, gets you 90 or 95% of the way there. But you're absolutely right that you could do even better and get to 98 or 99% accuracy by factoring in the slope at the hole and exactly how difficult the putt is, taking into account more than just the distance.
Would you say for an amateur golfer that it's more important to get the ball close to the hole than it is to leave yourself an uphill putt? I know it's a broad question and there's distances got to be factored in, but is there a major difference in leaving yourself a putt that breaks or an 8-footer straight up the hill?
Absolutely. I think the evidence says that it's better to end up closer to the hole than leave yourself an uphill putt. One way to think about that is if you take this shot pattern of your putts, and if you're 20, 30, 40, 50 feet away, you pretty much want to have that centered around the hole so that you have as many 1, 2, and 3 footers as possible. So you want to, it's like throwing a dart at a dartboard. You want to center it around the bullseye to give the most chance of it going in or hitting the bullseye, but also to leave yourself the shortest second putt. If you aim to leave yourself, if your goal is to leave yourself with a second putt that's uphill, instead of having 1, 2, and 3 footers left, you're going to have 3, 4, and 5 footers left. And yeah, though that 5 foot uphill putt is easier than a 5 foot downhill putt, but it's always easier to have a 2 foot side hill putt or a 2 foot downhill putt than it is to have a 5 foot uphill putt. And, so there is a big difference between uphill and downhill, but there's an even big difference between 3 footers and 5 footers. And that's why you want to sort of in your longer putt strategy, try and, center it around the hole rather than try and leave yourself an uphill putt.
I'm not really sure I have a question with this, but I was just surprised to see in the data and looking at the charts within the book that how fast the drop off of the make percentage goes, even for professionals, once you get outside like that 12-foot range, and just how small the make percentages are.